Welcome to a presentation on safety in confined spaces and what it means for weatherization work. This is presented by the Building Performance Center. Today we're going to cover several topics related to confined space and the rule by OSHA that governs our safety in confined spaces. We'll do a quick overview of the rule itself. We'll talk about WSHA versus OSHA. We'll cover terms and definitions. We're going to talk about identifying the different hazards that are common to weatherization work, and we'll talk about the competent person who identifies those hazards. And we're going to talk about how to be compliant in Washington State under the confined space rule. And lastly, we'll try to clear up some common questions and offer you some resources to use going forward with confined spaces. Okay, we're going to start with our overview of confined spaces. This rule came into effect a couple years ago. There was already a rule in the general industry and was brought to the construction industry by OSHA. Typically, we think about confined spaces and safety in more industrial settings. You can see some graphics here working down in some type of manhole and also a grain silo. Weatherization is the construction industry, and so confined space rules for the last couple of years have applied to weatherization work. Fatalities can happen even in weatherization or in construction. That is in fact what spurred this rule coming into construction. There were two fatalities. They occurred in underfloor crawl spaces on construction sites. Both involved explosions. One was from two-part foam being used, and the off-gassing had created an explosive atmosphere, and the other was an explosion from a dangerous atmosphere, a combustible atmosphere from some liquid applied wood stain, I believe. The rule's intent is to prevent fatalities. Traditionally, weatherization has been, we've had a good track record for safety. So what's the impact to weatherization work? When the rule first came out, there were a lot of concerns that it would really change how work is done, and that's not so much the case. Most of our work is not impacted. You only need one auditor when you do a weatherization assessment, and you only need one inspector on site. There was concern initially that we'd have to double up and send out a team for these. That's not the case. An unfloored attic is not a fall hazard, so again, our work in attics is not really changing under the confined space rule. One change is that compliance documentation is required, and we'll get into what this means for local agencies later on in the presentation. So let's talk about WSHA versus OSHA next. WSHA is not a body of people. It is a law, and it's our state safety plan. It's enforced by Department of Labor and Industries, specifically the Department of Occupational Safety and Health. So who makes the rules in Washington? The answer is DOSH enforces WSHA for weatherization agencies. So L&I, a division of L&I, enforces WSHA, which is a safety law in Washington weatherization. So is WSHA the same as OSHA? Well, as far as a confined space goes, the language is comparable. And again, it's DOSH runs the show and enforces the safety rules in Washington. So the answer is no, OSHA is not the same as OSHA, but we have the same impact on confined space work that other states do where OSHA is in control and enforcing. Okay, let's talk about terms and definitions. Find out what is a confined space. So a confined space is, I'm sorry, let's back up for just a moment, why don't we? These are some of the terms and definitions that we'll cover today. Confined space, permit required confined space. We'll talk about hazards, specific hazards. So a confined space defined. Let's cover these definitions that are related to the confined space rule. We've been working in confined spaces for a long time. Attics are examples, crawl spaces are examples. It's large enough and so arranged that an employee can bodily enter it. Here's a picture of somebody going in an underfloor crawl space. That's indeed going to be a confined space. The other component to make it a confined space is it must have limited or restricted means for entry and exit. And also that space must not be designed for continuous employee occupancy. So as you can see, attics and crawl spaces are perfect examples of confined spaces. A permit required confined space is any confined space that meets the following conditions. Presence of potential of hazards. There are 4 types, and we'll talk about those in a bit. Here they are. Hazardous atmosphere contains a material that has a potential for engulfing an entrant or this hazard, entrapment by inwardly converging walls or a sloping floor, or recognized serious safety or health hazard. So permit required confined space, we refer to this as just a permit space. There is no actual permit that's authorized by a code official. No paper permit, DOSH or L&I or OSHA, nobody issues a permit. A permit is controlling employees going in and out of that space if there's a hazard. So if it's a permit required confined space, employers control and monitor entry into the permit spaces, and workers must be permitted to enter before they can go in. Okay, let's talk about identifying hazards and competent persons. These are hazards that trigger permit spaces. That means if there's a confined space that has one of these 4 hazards, it's then going to be a permit space, which again is short for permit required confined space. So there might be a hazardous atmosphere or engulfment or entrapment. We talked about these already. Or lastly, a physical hazard. Generally in weatherization, we're only going to find a hazardous atmosphere, some gaseous danger that's in the atmosphere, or a physical hazard. Physical hazard is a broad category. It may include electrical hazards, for instance. So let's talk about hazardous atmospheres first. These are defined as immediately dangerous to life and death. So if it's the atmosphere, it means that the danger may be in breathing it, or the danger may be in that it could ignite and explode. These might be pre-existing dangers that you find on site, such as a gas leak. They may also be created during the course of work. So you could create a hazardous atmosphere if you are spraying two-part foam, because the off-gassing produces essentially poisonous gas. We'll look at some specific examples of atmospheric hazards next. Also important to know that the hazardous atmosphere is evaluated using a 4-gas monitor. Safety of the atmosphere is most commonly measured with a device like this. Here are some examples of what you might find on site, hazardous atmospheres you might find on site. Lack of oxygen, combustible gases, hydrogen sulfide, commonly sewer gas, or it can result from decomposition as well of organic material, or carbon monoxide, byproduct of combustion. We have some specific thresholds for safety for these atmospheric hazards. Please take a minute to review these OSHA thresholds. And to offer some clarity, LEL stands for lower explosive limit. You see that in bullet number 2 and 3. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about specific hazardous atmospheres. Carbon monoxide, how much is too much? Well, there's not just one answer. Carbon monoxide limits from Department of Commerce refer to ambient levels. Building Performance Institute, BPI, they also give guidance for ambient levels of CO. We're going to focus on worker exposure and worker safety today, as this is related to OSHA's confined space. So let's talk about OSHA's permissible exposure limit. A permissible exposure limit is typically the amount of a hazard that workers can be exposed to over the course of a period of time. Usually we're talking about an 8-hour day. So here is OSHA's permissible exposure limit for carbon monoxide. A worker can be exposed to 50 parts per million continually over the course of 8 hours, not to exceed 8 hours. Now that permissible exposure limit is a time-weighted average. So during that 8 hours, there could be periods of time where the worker is exposed to greater concentrations, and there could be periods of time where the worker is exposed to concentrations less than 50 parts per million. That's a time-weighted average. Please take a minute to review the following information detailing the effects of carbon monoxide. Next, we'll talk about hydrogen sulfide. How much is too much? Again, we'll refer to OSHA's permissible exposure limit for workers. This is for an 8-hour period. It's 10 parts per million. With hydrogen sulfide, injury and death can occur once we exceed 400 parts per million. OSHA says that atmospheres containing high concentrations, anything over 100 parts per million, hydrogen sulfide, are considered immediately dangerous to life and health. So far, we've discussed detecting pre-existing atmospheric hazards on site, but also, as we said before, construction work or weatherization work can create dangerous atmospheres. And again, when OSHA specifies dangerous atmosphere, hazardous atmosphere, it means immediately dangerous to life and health. Two-part foam traditionally has been used more in weatherization, less so now. The off-gassing is lethal. Single component foam sealants do not off-gas with lethal gases when they cure. There may be other building materials or sealants or liquid applied finishes that do create hazardous atmospheres as well. You'd refer to your MDS to determine safety levels. And of course, if you're working in a confined space, then you'll combine the confined space component of safety with the MDS. So that concludes our discussion of hazardous atmospheres that would trigger a permit required confined space. Now we'll talk about physical hazards. Physical hazards, these are a broader category of danger that would not be included in the three previous categories for confined space hazards. So there are physical hazards that will trigger a permit required confined space or a permit space. Any recognized serious safety or health hazard that pose an immediate danger to a worker's life or health, or would impair the worker's ability to escape from the space in the event of an injury. Workers need to be able to get out of the confined space on their own. And this is reiterated by OSHA. Again, if a hazard impedes a worker's exit without assistance, so if that worker can't get out of there by themselves, that is triggering a permit space. Here are some examples of physical hazards. Electrical hazards, potentially in a underfloor crawl space, and also high temperatures in attic spaces can trigger permit required confined spaces. Two examples of confined spaces here, and as soon as we have a physical hazard, it could trigger the permit requirement. Now that you have some idea of the potential hazards, we're going to look at OSHA's requirements around the process of identifying those hazards. Specifically, the competent person. The competent person is evaluating the confined space. The competent person determines whether that confined space is a permit required confined space. So they're determining whether it's a permit space. The competent person will document their findings. And this is important. When will the competent person do the documenting? Before an employer sends employees into a confined space, the competent person evaluates the space. So what makes a good, competent person, you might ask? They must be capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards associated with the working conditions. A competent person will have knowledge of the confined space rule, including OSHA's interpretation guidance. That would include a fact sheet put out by OSHA and also the frequently asked questions published by OSHA. Competent person is also going to have knowledge of potential hazards, familiarity with residential construction, familiarity with weatherization, and retrofit work. So, specific to atmospheric hazards, a competent person understands atmospheric hazards can travel with air movement. Atmospheric hazards from adjacent areas. There may be off-gassing going on in one part of the building, and it could lead or migrate to a confined space, creating a dangerous atmosphere or a hazardous atmosphere in the confined space. Competent person's aware of what's going on in the whole building. Competent person can also identify presence of fuel lines and identify fuel leaks. This should not be much of a stretch for weatherization workers who are familiar with combustion safety testing and gas leak detection. What's also required in the confined space rule is to measure the actual concentration, to quantify the concentration of combustible gas. Continuing on with atmospheric hazards, a competent person can identify the presence of sewer lines and detect sewer gas. This would be done with a 4-gas monitor as pictured in the top right. Competent person can identify combustion exhaust hazards. Anytime a combustion appliance is located in a confined space, there's a potential for the exhaust from that appliance to create an atmospheric hazard in that confined space. Again, combustion safety testing for weatherization work will help detect this. Now we'll discuss some physical hazards that are common to weatherization job sites. Competent person can identify electrical hazards. Competent person will identify thermal hazards as well. And this is specifically with attic spaces on hot, sunny days. Okay, let's talk now about compliance for local agencies. You have an idea of the competent person and the hazards they'll be looking for. So we'll talk about, again, how to be compliant in the confined space rule. So, compliance when you're working in a permit spaces and you're actually sending workers into permit spaces. Well, any employer, including local agencies, if you send workers into permit spaces, you'll need a confined space program. For a confined space program, you're needing to authorize any entrance into that permit required confined space. You're going to have to assign and train attendants to stand outside the space anytime an entrant is inside the confined space, the permit required confined space that is, and you'll need an entry supervisor as well. If you're sending workers into permit-required confined spaces, you'll need training specific for these workers related to the hazards and the work that they're doing in that confined space. You'll also need a rescue plan as part of your confined space program. Your confined space program has documentation associated with it as well, including that rescue plan. That's a pretty heavy lift, and for that reason, in Washington weatherization, we don't do it. We don't work in permit spaces. It's possible to avoid that with the vast majority, I would say all of our projects in Washington weatherization. On the left, you see a circuit in the electrical panel that's been locked out. If there were an electrical hazard, you can basically remove that hazard by locking out that circuit. And as far as atmospheric hazards go, those are fairly easy to control by not doing the work, not using the materials that produce. So in Washington weatherization, we're going to avoid and prevent permit spaces. So even if local agencies do not send workers into permit spaces, there are some compliance steps. Compliance involves protocol around how we assess and document our confined spaces. There are three pieces to this. One is a competent person must meet the required qualifications. The second piece is program coordinators, program managers must document the competent persons. And lastly, confined space evaluation form must be used to document the conditions of the work sites. So when that competent person is evaluating the confined spaces, they must document it on the confined space evaluation form. So let's look at each of these a little more closely. The competent person has to meet three required qualifications. They've got to have an OSHA 10 card. They've got to be familiar with some OSHA confined space documents. And they have to view this presentation. Now, the second of the three requirements for local agencies involves documenting their competent persons. Department of Commerce requires documentation of competent persons. There is a form for this. It's called the attestation form, and that's where a local agency will attest to the competence of their persons. This form does two things. It identifies the competent persons among the local agency staff, and it confirms that the competent person requirements are met. There's a form available on the BPC website for local agencies to use to attest to their competent people. Now, program managers and program coordinators are required to send the attestation forms to the Building Performance Center. Typically, you'll be interacting with Robin Kauppala. Always a pleasant experience. She can help you locate the form, and she'll receive it once you have it completed. And she'll answer any questions you might have along the way. So the third and final of those three requirements, again, for agencies that are documenting their confined space evaluation, is to use a confined space evaluation form. This is required by OSHA and required by Department of Commerce. The form's completed by the competent person, The form identifies all the confined spaces on site, and it identifies all hazards that might trigger permit space status of any of those confined spaces. Okay, where are we in our list of topics for today? Oh, we're at the last one. We're going to, in this last section, we'll give some clarifications. We'll review some of the frequently asked questions from OSHA that are most pertinent to weatherization. And we'll list a few resources that might be of use to you as you maintain your confined space compliance for Washington weatherization. So OSHA says attics as confined spaces. They can be confined spaces. However, OSHA generalizes about attics. So OSHA here is confirming what weatherization workers typically understand. While an attic is a confined space, it's not typical that it will have a hazard so dangerous that a permit is required. OSHA says the following dangers alone do not warrant a permit space: presence of a hazard, animals, OSHA says that unsafe conditions could exist. It doesn't mean there's a hazard present. There might not be risk of exposure to a physical hazard, or it will not impede the ability to exit the space without assistance. You may also isolate the physical hazard. So if you can prevent the workers from getting hurt from that hazard by physically separating the workers from the hazard, you've isolated it and it's no longer a permit space. You can also control the hazard in order to de-permit the space. Locking out the electrical panel is an example of this. You go in the crawl space, you find some live wires that are dangerous. That is a physical hazard, but if you turn the circuit off and lock it out, you're controlling that hazard and it's no longer a permit space. Then you would go ahead, have the electrical hazard repaired, carry on with weatherization work. Now we'll run through some of the frequently asked questions that are published by OSHA. These are published in response to the questions that they've received from the construction industry. We've selected some of the clarifications that are most pertinent to the work that we do in weatherization. There's a total of, I think, 75 of these frequently asked questions. You'll read them all for yourself at some point. You'll be given time right now to read these slides for yourself as we progress through them. Well, congratulations. You made it to the last slide. Thank you for working through this presentation. There's a lot of information here to process. Here on this slide, there are some resources to help with your confined space compliance effort. If you have any questions, please contact the Building Performance Center.